First, I'd like to thank Emily for the introduction. Thank you very much, Emily. And also, I'd like to thank Dr. Melanie Adams and colleagues here at the History Museum for inviting me to speak. From Africa to America, new name. Section 8, Hope 6, then Katrina came. Moved in, moved out, and moved away. Now I'm back to the city and here to stay. Regentrified, redeveloped, and renewal of bad hoods, bad people, and bad schools. Once minority, now urban, no real change. It's all the same, but a different name. New Orleans, St. Louis, or New York. Different city, same state. That's how it works. Whether policy promises or a shovel, as James Baldwin said, it is still Negro removal. Again, I've been here approximately 6 months here in St. Louis. I'm new to the city, having arrived here from Atlanta, Georgia. And one of the things that I've learned when you're in St. Louis is that people want to know, where do you attend high school? Is that right? All right. Well, people ask me that, I say, I'm not from here. And they would ask, well, where are you from? And that's a very, very important question. But I want to let you know that there's another question beyond where I went to high school that I'm often asked. The question, there are a couple of questions that I've been asked. Generally, these questions would come from black people and white people. The question is framed differently, though. So I would meet some colleagues, some white colleagues. I would meet them different places, and places where endowed professors would be. Just think about the kind of people you're generally interacting with. And I would meet them and they say, Jerome, are you enjoying St. Louis? I said, St. Louis is fine. And I kind of figured that I didn't give them the response. It must have been a lukewarm response. I guess they wanted me to say, well, I'm excited to be here. They generally, in response to my lukewarm response, respond by saying, well, my family loves it here. We love St. Louis. This is a great place for our family. I said, all right, thank you, thank you. Well, the other thing, but then, I would be at the park, over at Heman Park, over in U City area, off of Olive. Is that off Olive, right? Right. I know St. Louis a little bit. But I would be over in that area, or I would be over on Natural Bridge somewhere, Benton, anywhere. And I would run into black people, and we would just be talking. They would ask, I would tell them I just moved here, and they were like, all right. They said, where are you coming from? I said, well, I just came from Atlanta. They said, where? I said, Atlanta. And they would say, man, where the hell you come here from? I didn't respond. I said, hold on, I started trying to explain myself. I said, I got to just explain it here. I said, well, I have an endowed professorship. I'm really interested in issues of race, social class, and gender. I'm really trying to understand the education of black folks here in St. Louis. They said, man, listen, I'm trying to get out of here. The only thing holding me here is my kinfolks, my mom and them, and all those folks. That's why I'm here. And I said, okay, I started thinking, well, maybe this is just an isolated moment here, and they're just telling me something. But then I recognized that this was a weekly ritual. People were, every time, they would just say that to me, and I realized that St. Louis, I know a lot of speakers have talked about different things, and I know people, we come in from the outside. I'm able to look at St. Louis from a very different vantage point. But I came in, and so I see it, and I'm living it. It's very interesting. But one of the things is we have to honor, it's not about whether black people hate St. Louis or don't like it, or white people love St. Louis. It illustrates that racial divide we're talking about. Is that people have a different perception of opportunity. And it has historical grounding in terms of that perception of opportunity. So we have to honor that, and that's one of the things that I'm learning in terms of being here in St. Louis. So when I'm posed, this question is posed to me often, and what I've had to do is say to myself, well, I need to really understand this more in depth. And the title of my talk, as Emily had mentioned, All Around the City, Same Song, White Currency, Black Stigmatization, and the Persistence of Housing and Schooling Inequality. Does anyone in here know where I got that title from? Any old school hip hop folks up in here? Raise your hand over there, right there. Yes. Who's that from?
Digital Underground.
Digital Underground. Remember, Tupac was a rapper in Digital Underground. So all around, but one of the things that Digital Underground basically was able to tell us that a lot of the stuff you see is there's nothing new under the sun. You've seen it, the same kind of stuff plays out. A lot of people say to me, well, St. Louis, before we took the job, they said, why do you leave University of Georgia? Why would you leave Atlanta to come here? And I would talk to my folks, my kin folks in Birmingham. I grew up in Birmingham. Talk to some friends and family members in Atlanta, folks in Nashville, Tennessee. And that's the deep south, right? Guess what they would say? Now, you need to be careful when you go to St. Louis. And I'm reminded of Malcolm X. Every time people used to make fun of Malcolm X, Malcolm X used to make fun of people when he would say, everybody would say disparaging comments about the South. And they would say, the South, and Malcolm said, anything south of the Canadian border is the South. So anything outside of St. Louis is still St. Louis in America, okay? There is no demarcation in terms of the differences between black folks' experiences here and black folks' experiences everywhere else. It's all the same. So I'd like to build on and extend some of the earlier conversations by pulling from a number of research studies and experiences. I show how some of the inequities that people feel in St. Louis and its suburbs is ever present. So I've got 3 points to make this afternoon. I'd like to leave you with them. The first point is this. It's about white currency. And that is whiteness and the proximity to whiteness remains the most valuable currency in American housing and education. Whiteness and the proximity to whiteness. It can be almost white, because you understand what I mean. Whiteness and the proximity to whiteness remains the most valuable currency in American housing and education. To illustrate this notion of whiteness as currency, I will read excerpts from a book I'm writing entitled Central City's Blue. It shows why this work is particularly important to me. Just bear with me, please. I'm going to read. December the 5th, 1968, was my mother's 26th birthday, and the day she signed a lease to move my 5 older brothers and me into a 3-bedroom apartment in Central City. I was only 8 months at the time. Central City was a low-rise government housing community originally built for poor and working-class white people in 1940. The red brick and 1, 2, and 3-story rectangular-shaped buildings provided young white families and elderly white residents on meager and fixed incomes with a place that they could call home. Crack. On April 4th, 1968, a sniper's bullet tore into the flesh of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as he stood tall on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. Dr. King felt compelled to go to Memphis to support the efforts by sanitation workers who were grossly mistreated and underpaid. After King's assassination, black discontent was set ablaze throughout the urban United States, resulting in a black rebellion in more than 100 cities from coast to coast. This exploding powder keg had awakened the public's consciousness to the gross inequities suffered by those experiencing America's abyss and singing its blues, not only in places like Memphis, but throughout the United States. The Memphis strike and King's death have brought immense attention to how abject poverty, dilapidated and segregated housing, and educational inequality were manifestations of racial and economic injustices and discrimination. 1 week after King's assassination, and thus to quell black social unrest throughout the United States, Congress hastily passed the Fair Housing Act, thereby declaring it illegal for Negroes to be excluded from public housing, once reserved exclusively for white people. Around the age of 3 is the beginning of my earliest remembrances. 3 years is when I remember playing with new friends outside who had moved into Central City. It was the age I remember my mother's swollen belly and the talk of another child. 3 years was the age I remember hearing grown folks' conversations about how the white folks were leaving Central City as fast as the black folks were moving in. The year was 1972. As a child back then, I didn't fully understand what was going on. I was puzzled as to why the white children were moving away. As an adult, however, I began to understand. For the most part, white people, barring the few who cannot afford to flee or the elderly, often move from an area as soon as large numbers of black people desire to live there. This is true even if the black people come from a higher socioeconomic class than the whites, no matter the school quality, housing stock, and perceived safety of the neighborhood all remain the same. For middle and upper class black people, their social class status can minimize the effects of this caste-like status temporarily, but only if they remain an infinitesimal number in the community, usually 1 or 2 black families in an otherwise all-white neighborhood. However, this social class benefit or protective factor, think about that as a social scientist. For some black people, against prejudgment by white people, even if one must even think about just being one of few black people in a setting as a protective factor, think about that. It begins to dissipate once a critical mass of black people moves into the once all-white neighborhoods and quite often all-white schools. Whites' fears about crime, quality of neighborhood, etc. become heightened and they leave. In essence, whiteness operates like currency and serves as a kind of property and a psychological wage for white people, as noted by the esteemed scholar W.E.B. Du Bois more than a century ago. This whiteness as property may be converted into tangible and intangible benefits across many areas of one's existence, including employment, opportunities, schooling, housing, the legal system, etc. This is the fundamental nature of a race and class stratified society such as the United States. Now, if white people had remained in Central City amid the increasing black residents, their decisions to stay could have symbolically represented some degree of civic and civil rights progress for Birmingham and the larger national story of integration. However, those white families that fled into nearby suburbs with the assistance of federal housing vouchers were intent on holding on to whatever little valuable commodity they possessed, namely their white skin. The notion that whiteness is a wage or property did not begin or end with Central City or Birmingham or the state of Alabama. Throughout the United States, many white people, but clearly not all, have taken measures to ensure they maintain their majority status in the most desired jobs, neighborhoods, and schools. White residents' decision to leave Central City in droves were not very different from that which occurs today. The recent departure of white people away from black people in terms of housing, however, is euphemistically framed using social class as a substitute for race and other forms of coded language. It is very clear that these demographic shifts reify entrenched racial patterns of segregation and economic inequality. There is an economic incentive for white people to maintain racially segregated neighborhoods and an educational benefit to maintain predominantly white schools, even if some of them might say they would like to live in more racially diverse areas. Still, white people fleeing from Central City did not crimp our style. Used to functioning away from their everyday gaze, we committed ourselves to making Central City our community. This is a photo in 1975, roughly, of my brother and a lot of his friends, some of his friends. I was too young to look that stylish. And I'm trying my best right now. However, when the residential composition increasingly and was rapidly becoming black by the early 1970s, the maintenance crews in Central City mowed the lawns less frequently. There was a general perception held by some that the overwhelming presence of black people in the community eventually brings it down. Embedded in this thinking is the notion that black people do not take care of the communities where they live. I assert that it's not so much about black people in poverty bringing an area down. It is that when black people become inhabitants or renters in an area, management, landlords, and city officials are not as responsive to black people. They're not responsive to black people's complaints as they are to whites. How do I know this? Sociologists have written prolifically about this phenomenon. Massey and Denton, you familiar with those names? They've written about this phenomenon. This is the case, believe it or not, even for black middle-class residents who live in black suburbs. We just left a black suburb of Atlanta, and the responsiveness is different, even though the black people's education level is higher. Now, how do you mitigate that? That's a question we need to think about. The second conclusion I have come to from my travels around the world is this. When legal policies relative to education and housing were enacted and implemented, when legal policies relative to education and housing were enacted and implemented with the foundational premise that black people, black communities and institutions have mental value. I can talk about Brown versus Board of Education. And when it was implemented, overwhelmingly, black schools were closed. Even those black schools that performed better than white schools. Black educators were demoted or fired. Or if they taught chemistry, they became a home economics teacher in the white high school. Vanessa Siller Walker and James Anderson. Vanessa Siller Walker wrote a book, The Highest Potential. James Anderson wrote a book, The Education of Blacks in the South. They documented this. People have written about this. And then when black children went into black schools, into predominantly white schools, everything culturally, the mascot, the way the band performed, you know how black bands do it, right? They had to leave all that behind. So you basically are moving into a cultural context that is alienating from or decentering or decenters you as a child, and you're expected to learn. And your parents, all they can tell you, don't pay attention to the racism, you're there to perform in school. You understand? That onus on the children. So the second point is that legal policies, think about relative to education and how it were enacted and implemented with the foundational premise that black people, black communities and institutions have little value. I illustrate this from my study of urban and suburban schools in St. Louis. From 1994 to 2001, I focused on the St. Louis desegregation plan. This was a major research grant. I was finishing up my PhD at Vanderbilt University, and I continued the work in Atlanta, Georgia. So I looked at two different school contexts. One, a district that had a major desegregation plan, and that's St. Louis. They had the voluntary Inter-District Coordinating Committee was monitoring or managing what was called the largest voluntary desegregation plan in the nation. Then I looked at another district. I looked at Atlanta, Georgia, back in the early 1970s. Atlanta people would say they were somewhat realistic about what was going on, or somewhat pragmatic about the whole matter. But Atlanta had abandoned its desegregation plan in the 1970s in exchange for black control of schools. So they said, well, we know the white folks don't want us in school with them. They said, well, why don't you give us control of the black schools? We'll have black administrators, black principals, black district leaders, etc. St. Louis pursued the route of desegregation. And what I had done is I looked at a community. This was in St. Louis. You know the area called the Ville by Fairground Park area? Mm-hmm. I looked at a community, and my work was more community-based research. And I used that as the focal point. You were to look at this area of the Ville. And I looked at the community. Where did the black children? Here was the option. Can you still hear me back there? Here was the option what they had in St. Louis in the voluntary desegregation plan. Black families had the option of their children attending one of three types of schools. The first would be the neighborhood black school, generally a neighborhood black school. And there's one school I call, it's a pseudonym here, Fairmont Elementary School. Or they could apply for their children to attend a lottery, participate in a lottery, and attend a magnet school. And what I did is I looked at families from this area called the Ville and asked, where were these families most likely to send their children to school? Denson Magnet School. If they chose to move outside of the area and didn't send their child to Fairmont, they went to Denson. 10 families sent their children to Denson. Then they had the option of their children attending a school in the suburbs or the county. And I asked, where did families from that area, where would they send their children to school if given the option? 3 families chose Spring Hill. So we generally are talking about 13 families outside of the community. What does that tell you about Fairmont before I even talk more about it? What can you infer that would say about Fairmont? That what? Is what?
Low performing.
Low performing. 13 families. Is that a lot of families?
No.
Okay, I didn't think it was. Okay, I'll talk more about that. But St. Louis had the DSEG plan. Now, here, let me give you the social-political context. Here's what was going to happen. The judge was saying, hey, if you don't desegregate, we're going to desegregate for you. So what happened is 16 surrounding districts in the county districts, got together and said, we're not going to let them dictate how this thing plays out. So they got together, and 16 came together and said, we will help shape the terms in which black children come out to our schools. And one of the options was that if black children come out to the school, you have to send the money along with them. So there was money following the black children. The second was that if black children, if our children, white children, I hope folks don't feel like I'm talking about them. You don't feel like it. No, let me pause that because I realize I'm in St. Louis and some folks participated in the DSEG plan or were educators. So I know this can be a very sensitive matter, but I have to still tell the truth about the research. Okay, let me move on. So the point is that white families had the option of sending their children into the schools in St. Louis. What type of schools could they send their children into in St. Louis? Who knows? Magnet schools. They weren't going to just send them to any regular black school. A magnet school. Highly resourced magnet school. The black families sent their children to the county school. What was the attractor for them to come out to the county school? The mere fact that it was what? It was a white school, period. There was no theme associated with it. There was nothing in terms of it being an arts and performance school. It was strictly, it just was a white school, period. That illustrates the point about currency. So I've written about this in my book, Troubling the Waters, Fulfilling the Promise of Quality Public Schooling for Black Children. And what I want to do is highlight to you one of the things, this man, Mr. Steele, I use his name, he's the principal of that school. I know it's kind of a lot of text here. It was Fairmont Elementary School. He's the principal of the school. And I'll tell you some things about the school with some slides and all. But Mr. Steele had a critique of what was going on. So I'm using folks who describe black families and educators who talked about their perception on the DCA plan. And he said, parents have been sold on the idea, and the school systems and the courts have assisted the parents with a publicity blitz called School of Choice, that the all-black schools in St. Louis are not as, I'm sorry, it should be as good as those, maybe it was something, a Freudian slip, that they're not God, as those in the counties. There will be signs everywhere such as, do you want your child to go out to a good school? Do you want your child to have a good education? Send him or her to a county school. Call your voluntary inter-district coordinating committee. What kind of message is that to send? Now, Mr. Steele was the principal of Fairmont, an all-black neighborhood elementary school in St. Louis, for almost 30 years. This was a school that was consistently recognized by African-American community leaders and the school system for the quality of education provided